Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way.
So we're talking about Keirsey. So David Keirsey that we talked about in the historical section before, his addition to Myers-Briggs. He took the same 16 types using the same 4 letters we've been learning about, but then he had a different take on them, as well as he divided them into 4 groups. Keirsey focused on observable traits, basically what we do and what we say, as opposed to some of the other stuff. Some of this internal stuff he didn't feel was very easy to quantify, and it was easy to possibly you'll get off in the weeds there, and so he focused on those. One of his criticisms of Myers-Briggs was that he did not think you could cut everything, slice and dice everything, as I said earlier, into every different category. So you can't really say, all thinkers are like this because there's 4 different types and they all have different, the other variables affect that some, or you can't say all perceivers are the same. He had an algorithm that he felt, as I said before, that the intuitive sensor was the most clearly dividing factor between the types, and so the 8 sensor types have more different than the 8 intuitive types than any other split. In creating his 4 groups, then he definitely used that variable to split it, and so what his goal was to group the 4 types based on their purpose in the world, their function in the world, like what they care about the most. Again, observable external traits. For the intuitives, then, where they're interested in lots of abstract concepts and principles and analysis, he then felt that the thinker-feeler was the next logical way to divide them. When you're abstractly talking about concepts, are you looking at more logical pieces, or are you looking at more people stuff? And he felt that was the cleanest split between the 8 intuitive types. And so then he created 2 of the Keirsey groups, which was intuitive thinkers and intuitive feeler. Now on the sensor side, where they're perceiving lots of data, lots of concrete data, they're not analyzing, they're bringing it in, he felt what you did with that data then was the most defining difference between different types of sensors. So the judging types, which are not usually to preserve traditions, help people do other stuff like that, versus what he calls the artisans, the sensing perceivers. Remember perceiver, more laid back, not as driven to do things. So they're more like entertainers, other pieces like that. So he felt that those were the 4 ways that you best could split the groups. And then, as I mentioned in the last bullet, and I've said before, so Myers-Briggs and Keirsey, I kind of use them complementing. So they kind of describe the same things in different ways, and they kind of build on each other. If you started delving into all this, kind of use them both for it. So if we go into slide 16 then, so you can have a fun little exercise of seeing the pictures in the top right and seeing different historical people of what types they are. But these are the 4 names that Keirsey assigned. So the guardians, the SJs, so sensing judgers, the artisans, the sensing perceivers, the rationals, the intuitive thinkers, and the idealists, the intuitive feelers. So if we start in the guardian groups, remember these are the sensors, so very in the now, concrete, not a lot of analysis, and then judging, so using that to execute things in the external world. This type, and we have an example on the top of George Washington, we're very concerned with duties and responsibilities, careful to respect laws, rules, and others' rights. And they're driven to serve others and preserve society. So they're kind of the backbone of society, and actually we'll see later that actually almost half of the people in the world are the guardians. So the second group is the artisans, so the sensing perceivers. Again, these are taking in concrete facts, not analyze them a lot, and then just are relaxed with them. So they can are not driven to accomplish huge things with them. And so like I said, there are lots of entertainers, actors, there's lots of different types of actors. So they're more concerned with the experience, what they see and feel. Will do whatever works quickly and effectively, even if it requires bending the rules. So they're not as worried about following the rules and upholding the rules like the guardians are. And they're very spontaneous, competitive. Again, all the sports people we were talking about earlier, a lot of the dominant external sensors are in the artisan group. So then we move on to the third group, which is the rationals, the intuitive thinkers. This is the group I fall into. These are the people that want to dig down into how it works. They're intuitives, which means they're all about the analysis, the deep dive, the finding patterns, and then they're thinkers, so they're using that to solve logical problems. And so these are the engineers, the scientists. These are the people inventing the next computers. These are all these kind of people concerned with new ideas and interesting solutions. work to effectively achieve objectives ignoring arbitrary rules. So they also, since they're so about understanding how things work, if they think something isn't designed, so say a law is in place, but they understand how the laws were designed and think that was a stupid law, they might decide they should ignore it. Like when in their analysis, they're very non-compliant. The different four NTs are a little different, but they're not very compliant. And so, like I said, since they're analyzing everything, whereas a SJ would say, someone smart up there made this rule, and so I should follow it. And I'm not going to deeply analyze it and ask why too often. So the fourth group then are the idealists. So these are the intuitive feelers. So being intuitive again, they're deep diving, they're researching, they're learning different stuff, understanding how stuff works, but in this case they're going to use it, change something in a positive way. There's actually a lot of PhD clinical psychologists fall in this category. Actually in general, usually the intuitive types are the ones that like schooling more, are more likely to have doctorate degrees, and the sensors are not as interested in that, although there are definitely exceptions. So the NFs then work to accomplish goals while upholding their code of ethics. So internally, they're going to have a deep understanding of how I think people should be taken care of, how I think ethically things should be done, and they're going to work on these, not just taking for granted the laws, but they're going to really have their own views on how things should work and how everyone should get along and we should all take care of each other. And they're driven on personal growth and development in themselves and others. So that's what really would excite them. So if we go on to slide 17, so now we've gone through what are the different variables, what are the combination variables, what's the ordering, how do Keirsey add to it. So now let's talk about the 16 Myers-Briggs types. So look at all 16 of them. So on the right, we have a fun chart here which looks at different people in the Bible and what someone thought the personality type they would be. So that can be a fun exercise later too. So if you're going to get into this and use it in your practice or in personal life, you'll want to spend some time, probably starting with yourself, reading the description of your Myers-Briggs type. And usually over time you start getting to know, my friend is this type and this is kind of how they are. This is kind of a jump start to that. If you're familiar with these Bible characters in depth, then you can say, okay, well, King David, okay, I know about him, and then this is the type that he was, so that kind of helps me understand the types. And then the table on the left, I won't spend much time on, but it has, so like say purple at the top left are the two extroverted intuitive types, and then pink in the text, which means it's also introverted thinking, but its dominant function. The dominant function is the color around the wheel, and the secondary function is the coloring of the lettering of it. So this is a quick thing to look at, but again, there's lots of ways to get that information. So we'll see Queen Esther here is the example of an ENTP from the Bible. So if we go on to slide 18. This is the only type we're going to go into, and like I said, you'll want to read about different types, usually starting with your own. Now I can provide some resources on where to find good descriptions of those online as well as books. So we'll kind of talk about the ENTP. So for each of the types, Myers-Briggs and different websites will have slightly different names. We'll have a name of it, and then Keirsey will have his own different name, which is usually similar, but again, his different focus on the types. The ENTP type is called the visionary, or by Keirsey, the inventor. So you can see in the top right, there are the four ENTP function ordering that we derived earlier. So the dominant function being extroverted intuition, then introverted thinking. And so remember, the ENTP will work through, so the dominant extroverted intuition is their dominant function. So they'll go to this first, and then if they need introverted thinking to make decisions, they go to that second, which they're not as familiar with. Being a dominant external intuitive means that the ENTP's specialty is taking in external data and analyzing it, figuring out, assessing things, seeing patterns. So because being an intuitive type and not a sensor type, they're always interested in the why and how things fit together and how things work. This we'll talk about later in the notes is kind of called the lawyer type, but they're very quick they'll walk in a room and can easily assess what's going on, can easily pick up patterns of maybe someone's expression versus other people's expression. They can easily size up situations and figure out things. And so the example of the lawyer type is in a courtroom, they'd be very quick on their feet. So, someone uses a whole different strategy against them. They weren't planning on, they a lot of times quickly can come up with a counter strategy to do that. So very quick on their feet, usually very good conversationalist. So being part of the rationals group. So if we think about the Keirsey rationals group, so the NT group again, their goal in the world was to understand how things work, the scientists and engineers. So, but the NTB being a perceiver means that they do not have to have a purpose. It doesn't have to be actionable. Like they can decide they're excited about photography and then spend 6 months learning about that, and then they can decide they're just excited about cooking and then spend a bunch of time on that. It doesn't have to be things that are definitely relevant and have a big plan. Like a judging type would need a plan and why am I doing this, how is it actionable, etc. They're much more laid back. And so this ends up making them into kind of jack of all trades, expert at none. So the piece then, being a perceiver, then they're not going to usually follow through on the task. So they might, if they're interested in photography, they might buy a bunch of photography equipment, start learning about it a little bit, but then maybe leave it sit for 6 months because they get excited about something else. The reason they're the visionary is because, unlike a judging type who would say, we have a problem to solve, I want to solve it quickly and start executing it because that's what I'm interested in, the ENTP is not driven to go to that decision, so they might sit around for months thinking about this and that way of doing it, and maybe they'll invent a new way of coming up with it and spend time thinking about areas that no one else has thought about before. Now, but maybe the thing they invented was after they went on 16 other rat holes learning about stuff that didn't pan out. But so they're not driven to complete, so they understand things well, they can spend a lot of time on things that interest them and are fun. And so for all these types, and one of the big things that Myers-Briggs pushes is that no type is better than another. We're all good at some things and bad at some things. So you can see the ENTP type here, very good at sizing up situations, very good at in the external world, conversation. They actually, love verbal sparring and others, but then very bad at executing and very bad at completing tasks, and the very drudgery of everyday life can really bore them. And so again, it's all a balancing act. And some other type, say like an INTJ, might be expert at executing things, but then they don't really have coming up with the new ideas of what to do is very tough for them. And that's where all of us working together in teams can help do these things well. And so one other piece of the function of the ordering is, so since an ENTP is a dominant external intuitive, so their data collection function is in the extroverted world, if they're trying to solve a problem, lots of times they will go to friends or other people to try to talk through the ideas they have to help make the decisions. My dominant function is extroverted intuition, and I lots of times will be like, man, I need to figure this out, and then I call someone to talk about it. Versus other types are internal processors, so they'll be like, oh, I need to decide something. They're going to go off by themselves, process it for a while, and then come back with what they think the decision is. And again, this leads to the organized and unorganized perception, that if someone came to you and then throughout the conversation they have changed their mind 4 times and all this stuff, they seem very unorganized, versus a judging type that spent all this time ahead of time comes to you and says, this is what I'm doing, and they go do it, then they seem very organized. All right, so that's an example of one of them. And all the different types, there's feeling types that they're all about caring for different people. There's types that are experts. So one weakness of the ENTP would be if they needed to do the same task over and over, they would completely hate their life. Like that would be the most horrible thing for them. But there are types that specialize, like there's one type that's called the mechanic type. What they specialize in is being able to do things over and over, and they can over time hone their skills and be just exceptional with muscle memory, etc., at doing these tasks that these other types never will be able to get to because they can never have the patience for it. But those types actually enjoy it and just enjoy repeating that. And so these are different examples of how one person hates this, one person likes it. And that's where in the life coaching piece, if you get someone, the wrong person on type of the wrong job, they're really going to not like it, not excel, be very bored, etc. And so that's some of the power of understanding these different types. All right, so slide 19 is what I was trying to jump to earlier. And so this is the distribution of the different types. So on the left, you see there's all the individual preferences, and then the bottom 4 are the Keirsey temperament groups. And so I boxed out some different interesting observations of this, and then the columns I have the total as well as male and female distributions. So one common thing probably most people that don't even know Myers-Briggs realize is that the thinker-feeler variable is not 50-50. So by the genders. So there's many more feeling women than there are feeling men, and there's many more thinking men than there are women. And so this actually what drives into our cultural stereotype of women being more caring and emotional, those kind of things, and men being more logical and less caring, etc. But the interesting piece is, without the knowledge of Myers-Briggs, a lot of us just see these things, and as I mentioned in a slide later, books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, they kind of take these stereotypes and then they just imply all men are like this and all women are like this. Well, without understanding Myers-Briggs, so a feeler guy is not going to be like the description in Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. They're going to be more emotional, they're going to be more caring, and a thinker woman is not going to be that either. So this helps to build upon that information. With that in mind, then can be very useful. But that's where you get people saying, this just really didn't fit me, I'm not the typical, this or that. So that's one observation which I've boxed there, that about 75% of women are feelers. But interestingly, actually according to this data, which is from the Myers-Briggs Institute, which actually is a compilation of data all the way from 1972 to 2002, so it's based on quite a bit of data, that only 57% of men are thinkers. So actually men are actually more equally mixed, more equal on the thinker-feeler. But of course then we have the extra variable of society. So a woman that's a thinker is going to be much more nurtured. Most of the women around here are going to be feelers, and so she's going to nurture that maybe third feeling function or fourth feeling function much more than a guy probably would, because trying to fit in with society, be what she's told she should be. And so that actually modifies the type a little bit, even though she really is that type. But it's much harder for her. So, that's a piece where Myers-Briggs knowledge can be very powerful, that a woman that's just like, man, it's so easy for all these other people. Why? Or really what they usually think is, why am I so bad at this? Everyone else is so good at, being caring, and why am I so bad at it? Or for a guy, say a feeler guy, why do these other guys seem not to care when someone says these rude comments, but I have this big struggle on it? And so that's where understanding Myers-Briggs can be very powerful, that these types that are not the typical types can understand that this is how I was designed, it's not a weird thing, and there are other people like me. One example I have is a friend of mine that is a male feeler. When I first taught him Myers-Briggs, once he read the description, it was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly me. He printed it out and put it on his wall, and he said for the first time he felt understood, and he was like telling all his friends and showing all his friends this, because for his whole life he's been struggling with why am I different? Do people not understand me? So it can be very powerful to understand your type, especially when you're not the typical type, and also I'll say not a celebrated type. So our society has different stereotypes, like, they say usually judging is better than perceiving. Like, perceivers, oh, they're so unorganized and you should get up early and get all this work done. Why are you so unorganized? Or extroversion versus introversion, you should, be able to be very socially adept and out all the time, in social events, etc. So though for those types that are not celebrated or not typical, Myers-Briggs can be very powerful and really help building self-esteem of knowing that, like I said, God made them that way and it's normal and there's other people like them. A few other quick things to comment on slide 19 is sensor intuitive is by far the most disparate distribution. So you see that sensors are almost 3/4 of the world, and this is true for both genders, and intuitives are only 1/4 of the world. So most of the other variables, other than the thinker-feeler we were just talking about, are roughly split. So extrovert, introverts, about 50-50. Judge and perceivers, a little bit more. But so this one's very interesting, that 3/4 of the people in the world are sensors. And so if we look down in the Keirsey temperaments, you notice that, as I mentioned earlier and tried to get into earlier, the SJ types are 46% of the world. So even though they're only one of the 4 types, and the normal distribution would be 25%, it's almost double that. But if you look down to the NFs and the NTs, because intuition is so much more rare, together are only about 25%. And so the thing I think interesting here that makes a lot of sense to me is, when God was designing the world, and he obviously picks the distribution of how many types he gives to different people. If you think of when Jesus was on the earth, right, what is he doing? He's going around helping people, caring for people. He wasn't there just destroying the Roman laws, etc. And that is exactly what the SJ types are there to do. That their focus is caring for people, taking care of stuff, upholding society, doing all these things. Whereas the NT types, the intuitive thinkers, how many engineers and scientists do we need? We need some of them to design all our computers, etc., but we don't need a huge distribution of the world doing all that kind of work, and so that type is only 10% of the distribution. So anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting. All right, so if we go on to slide 20 then. So one thing I want to talk about, if you guys decided to use this in a clinical setting, one of the complaints some people have, or one of the difficulty areas, is around type assessment. There's a lot of different tests out there, but they usually ask stuff like, do you like to be the life of the party or do you not? Or that they ask a lot of things, and there's a lot of biases I'll go through here that mean that test and retest reliability can be somewhat low, and the accuracy of the testing can be a bit tricky. So some things that contribute to that is, as we were saying earlier, societal preferences. So if you're in a society where extroversion is preferred, some people answer the questions more what they wish they were than what they really are, and which can perturb your results. And I will have a side note actually that different societies around the world, and this is another interesting thing to study, actually have different preferences. So like German society is very much let's execute things, it's very TJ focused, and so their extrovert, especially perceiver extroverts, would be very not valued because their society is all about getting things done and not about being laid back and spending quality time and hanging out, whereas, Italy or Spain societies are much the opposite, that they're all about, community and relaxing, and they don't really care much about getting stuff done. And so in the different societies, you'd have different preferences for different things. The second one is nurture. So as I was mentioning before, a thinker woman is more likely to develop more of their tertiary inferior feeler functions than a guy is. And there's lots of examples of, some parents really value one type, and so the kids try to become more that type. And so now I still believe you're the same type, but you can look like somewhat similar. Usually you're not going to be trying to become another type is not usually be too successful. You can get there somewhat with a lot of work, but you're not going to be as good as the other type is naturally. So if you had interesting nurture, then someone might test differently than they actually are. And the other piece is people develop with age. I mean, your weaknesses you get better at overcoming through age. And so when you have, say, the perceiver, when they're always late to things and never finishing projects and stuff, throughout the perceiver's life, they're going to learn to deal with it better. And so if you have someone that's older and more developed taking the Myers-Briggs test, then they might answer some questions the other way, which might make it harder to figure out what their actual type is. So these are some of the pieces there. So there's two options for testing. There's official testing, which usually requires that the psychologist gets certified and involves some cost, and there's some free online tests. So the Myers-Briggs Foundation has 3 different tests that you can take training to learn how to administer, and there's official manuals, etc. And then their company is just called Keirsey.com, but it's what Keirsey founded. Also has an assessment with the same thing, a certification process, all these pieces. Now the one interesting thing I found here though is unlike some other types of assessments, even these professional tests still have a stage where you discuss this assessment with the patient or the client and then see if they think it fits them and then maybe use more input from them to decide if it really is the right answer. So this kind of talks to the testing strength. So it's not a test where you just take it and whatever result comes out, that's for sure right, and you go along your merry way. And I've actually put links to 2 free tests here. So this is what with people in non-clinical situations. My recommended method is you take some of these online tests, you see how they come out, and then you look. So some variables you're going to be very extreme on, and then some variables might be very close. So you read what the results come out, and you read the description, and maybe you read it with someone that knows you well, and see if you both think that describes you well. If it does, and usually it's kind of a epiphany that, oh my gosh, this is exactly describing. How do they know is lots of times a question that you get with it. But if it seems a little bit off, so if one variable is off, then some of the stuff will seem right, but some stuff will be way off. So then you can look at your test and say which was a marginal variable. So maybe I'm right on the thinker feeler, maybe I was a thinker of 1 out of 100. Then you might look at the feeler type of the letters that you tested and read those descriptions and see if they fit you better. I mean, usually it's not too hard to figure out what is your actual type. And so like I said, so I think there's ways around it, but that is one criticism of Myers-Briggs. Okay. So if we move on to slide 21, how do we use this in marriage and family therapy? How do we use this in life coaching? And so I pulled together a little information here of, I think, different examples and ways you can use it. So for marriage and family therapy, obviously if you have a family, this is a model to help understand the different people in the family and help them understand each other. Part of the purpose that it was made for. And so if you're having situations where the husband and wife can't get along or the children and the parents can't get along, that you might look at Myers-Briggs for a way to help explain it. And then you can actually explain it to them, give them resources as opposed to this kind of unquantifiable, we just don't see eye to eye on this thing or that thing. Like it helps bring an actual framework and description to these differences. But in marriages that were supposedly successful, Myers found, quote, that couples who were mainly alike outnumbered those who were mainly opposite. What she's talking about is, obviously as 2 people have 4 variables each, so you either could have all 4 the same, 3 the same, 2 the same, 1 the same, or none the same. And if the types were randomly distributed and Myers-Briggs had nothing to do with what people click better in marriages and what people stay married more, then you would expect you'd have 2 variables the same, just statistically. But the couples that had 3 or more variables the same, so 3 or 4 variables the same, which usually be somewhat unlikely, were twice as likely as the couples that only had 1 or 0 variables the same. The idea is there is a correlation between Myers-Briggs matching of people and how they get along, etc. And almost all of these couples had no understanding of Myers-Briggs before they got married. So this is just them picking out people that they click with and that they think would be good matches on lots of other factors. I had mentioned the third bullet already, that basically adding on to Men Are From Mars, Women From Venus kind of topics of not all men are the same, not all women are the same. And so if you have a client where the wife is a thinker or the husband is a feeler, then this can help explain to them why that's perfectly normal and fine, and how that works. Thinker wife really likes doing the finances and organizing that, and the feeler husband is the one organizing gift baskets to the neighbors or something. Like you might have flipped things, but you can understand why that's perfectly fine, and help them understand each other and why. Or maybe the husband loves sports, but the wife isn't intuitive and really dislikes him. Or you can help explain some of these differences in these family situations. So the fourth bullet is another one. The example I like to use here is introvert versus extrovert. So extroverted people usually have a strong desire to go to lots of social events, be out and about. They can't be stuck in the house a lot. And so there's a lot of marriages where an extrovert and introvert get married, and the extrovert, especially if it's a quality time love language, extrovert will want to go out all the time and do stuff all the time. But for them it's so easy and natural. They're like, well, why, if my spouse isn't interested in that and won't do it, then I guess they're just not trying and they don't care about me, etc. But Myers-Briggs could help explain, if they're an introverted, non-quality time person, to help explain that it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of energy for that introverted person to go out and be in the spotlight and do all these different things. And so it's much more, so it helps quantify why it's much harder and more expensive for that. And there's lots of different examples like that. And so it can help the person realize that if they do that, it's a much different thing than if I did that piece. And then I already mentioned the encouragement to uncelebrated or non-typical types. The last piece is interesting. So this study looked at different personality disorders and actually correlated them to Myers-Briggs types. And so Myers-Briggs types kind of can get its way into all sorts of different things. Like I could probably even argue that suicide risk could actually map to certain types more often than others. So in this study in 2001 from the University of Colorado, they found that these 3 personality types, ISTP, ISTJ, and INTP, those types were twice as common for people that were diagnosed with PTSD. And so for diagnoses, I don't think it's too useful that, knowing if the person's this type, that it's slightly more likely that they're the type, but I think in understanding how to deal with it. So if these 3 types are all ones very prone to this disorder, then I think if you look at some of the similarities of these types and how they're different from other types, it could help you understand, so maybe none of these types are feelers. So maybe for PTSD, they don't understand their emotions, and maybe some of these are low, maybe their feeling function's very low on the list. So they have these traumatic things and they have all these emotions spring up they don't understand how to work with. And so maybe that could help clue you into, let's help develop that lower function for this thing. And I think that can apply to lots of different psychological disorders, etc. Okay, so if we move on to slide 22. So another interesting piece, parents, as we talked about before, it's more likely that they're going to be similar types, that some similarity is definitely important in a successful marriage. And so likely you're going to have 2 parents that are similar types. And so they're going to like the same things, dislike the same things in some ways. And so if you then have a child that's a completely different type, and you don't realize that they're a different type, that can cause some different problems. So parents will value certain things, and they'll usually encourage their children to get good in the things that they feel are valuable in life. And the parents also maybe did things in a certain way or learned in certain ways. And so you can have big disconnects between the parent and child if both the parents are, have certain preferences and the child has different ones. So knowledge of that can be extremely powerful in it. So I have 2 real life examples here of families I know. The first example was a family where both the parents were extroverted sensors. And then there were 3 children, 2 that were sensors and 1 that was an intuitive child. And so the parents, the father had played sports growing up. He, now was a little too old to play them himself, and the 2 sensor children were really good at sports. They would go out there, so maybe they were extroverted sensors. They would go out there and just do great at it. And so he really celebrated that. He went to every game. He just really, and the children could tell that's very valued. Now the intuitive child, which actually in this case was an INTJ, is naturally very bad at sports. They're that's the scientist type. They have a small build. They're not super muscular. They're built for doing lots of complicated tasks in a lab, but they're not built for playing sports. So he would go out and try to play sports, but he was always horrible at it. And his father would kind of get on him. But on the flip side, he was so much better than his brothers in school. He would get straight A's all the time. But his father really didn't value that. It was more into the sports side of things. So he would bring home report cards of straight A's his whole life, and they'd just be like, well, that's just how he is. But then, and the dad would not celebrate that. But the sports side was celebrated significantly. So this young man that was the intuitive, even into his 30s, still has psychological issues of not being as respected, not being as celebrated, of feeling inferior to his brothers and other things, and that can have big impacts. So this is the natural progression of how this family would play out. But if someone was a counseling, or there's the Myers-Briggs knowledge, you then could realize that, for child A, that's a very sensitive person, you maybe want to use a different discipline technique than child B. That's a thinker that's not as sensitive to things, etc. So then the second example is a family with introverted thinking parents and then extroverted children, one thinker, one feeler. In this one, you have, you notice that all 3 of the 4 people in the family are thinkers. So we can already realize, we know the difference between thinkers and feelers. And so we can see that there's going to be problems, and especially since the feeler is the youngest. There's no example of how to, dealing with emotions and stuff takes some understanding and development over time. There's no examples in the family of how you do this. There's a logical conversation going on, and youngest is an extroverted feeler, so they're naturally going to be processing things externally. So there's logical discussion going on, and then, inputting different unprocessed emotional things into it, then the thinkers might be like, well, that doesn't really make sense for this reason and that reason, and kind of invalidates the feelings. The second piece is, since both parents are introverted and both children are extroverted, then they might be naturally good at, might not be nurtured, there might not be examples of them, there might not be opportunities for them to develop in those areas. So again, there's a myriad of examples of different combinations of all these things, but if someone understood Myers-Briggs and Keirsey, then they can understand why I should parent this child this way and that child that way, and this is what, and maybe if the skill set that's needed to help, say, the young feeler child develop, maybe an aunt or uncle or someone has a better skill set there that could maybe help develop that if neither the parents or the parents could develop it themselves. Slide 23 then is Myers-Briggs and life coaching. And so life coaching, this is kind of how Myers-Briggs was designed. That is, what Myers put it out was in World War II to help people pick their career choices, as I mentioned earlier. There are many websites and books that describe, once you know your type, have whole pages on strengths and weaknesses of the type and different career choices that would work with them, different things, how you can develop your weaknesses, how you can develop your strengths. There's a huge amount of resources here. As we've talked about, this will greatly help with self-understanding, help with interrelation, influence, and other people's skills. For life coaching, this is kind of the perfect tool. So as I said, identifying probable strengths and weaknesses so you can intentionally develop chosen areas. Even for romantically, it gives theories on what people might match up with you better. For work, it can provide insight on how you work. So different bosses and employee personality. So if you have a boss that's a dominant external thinker that's very organized and it's easy for them to execute on time, and you have a perceiver working for them, they're going to probably think very badly of them missing deadlines and other stuff, and it's so easy, why would it be hard for them? So the perceiver should really work hard to hit those deadlines, or try to find a different work situation. And then the bottom one, which I talked about a few times, is of confidence building. So people understanding that they are normal and as God designed them, and it's not if they're not one of the celebrated or typical personality types. All right, and then the last slide is kind of a more fun slide, slide 24, which is interesting correlations. So Myers-Briggs, once you start studying it, kind of has tentacles into all sorts of different parts of our lives. And so these are kind of fun. So I believe that Myers-Briggs types can track to love languages. So the Gary Chapman idea of there's 5 love languages and we all talk in different ones. So for instance, and that FE means an external feeler, dominant external feeler. So dominant external feelers that their goal in life is to encourage other people and be encouraged by other people and process emotions externally and all this kind of stuff. Makes a lot of sense that it's likely that they're going to have words of affirmation as a love language. For a dominant external thinker whose goal in life is to execute tasks and get things done, their acts of service, because to them the important currency is projects and execution. So someone doing a project for them lots of times is going to be a thing that's very valued, whereas quality time, let's go just spend a bunch of time just hanging out doing nothing, is probably not going to be one of their love languages. Now, there definitely are people of these types that are these others, but I think these are more trends. The second interesting one is Myers-Briggs types can correlate to physical body builds. So it makes sense that if God gives you a Myers-Briggs type of the personality that's going to fit your purpose in life, then it makes sense he also gives you a physical build that fits that purpose. And so if your type is the scientist in the lab type, then God doesn't need to give you a 6'5", huge muscle build. You can be a smaller person and be very successful at your career, versus if you're a dominant external sensor where being a soldier or a sports person is your goal. If you can pick up your senses really well, but then you have a very small person with no big muscular build, then you're probably not going to do very well at it. So there's lots of times in a lot of the people I know, I see strong correlations of different body types with different Myers-Briggs types. And then the last bullet is there's even books on, quote, speed reading. So a lot of people think it's pretty powerful if you can meet someone and pick out their type and then you talk to them differently, do different things, understanding their type. I mean, especially for sales or other stuff. So there's actually books that look into all sorts of stuff, like their demeanor, appearance, posture, communication style, hobbies, all sorts of stuff that people map to different personality types. I mean, this is something I actually use in everyday life too, that if I'm talking to a certain person, I might not go into nearly as much depth as if I'm talking to someone else on a certain topic, or because I know they're not going to be interested in it. Or there's lots of pieces where just in your everyday life, and you can kind of pick out these topics, not be more interested in this person or that person. So it really is a powerful tool outside of the clinical situation as well. So that takes us to the end of our slides. So I appreciate everybody coming in. We can close in prayer here. So dear Lord, thank you for this time today, Lord. Thank you for giving us the minds to be able to figure out all these different interesting situations, Lord. Thank you for loving us, and even before we're born, having an idea of what you want us to do in this world, and then giving us the tools to do it, Lord. And I pray this in Jesus' name, amen.
Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other. 'Cause Jesus is the way. Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other.